Hello, everyone. Welcome to the very first webinar of the Children's Screen Time Action Network. I'm Jean Rogers, the Screen Time Program Manager here at CCFC, where the network was launched just a little bit over 2 months ago. The network is a coalition of practitioners and educators coming together to support each other, share resources and best practices, and create practical solutions for families. Joining the network's free, and you'll find the membership link and some great resources on our website, screentimenetwork.org. And I'm very excited to announce our first conference. We'll be coming together face-to-face here in Boston, April 20th and 21st, and where today's presenter, Dr. Richard Freed, will be speaking. You'll hear more about the conference at the end of today's webinar. So welcome, Dr. Freed. Dr. Freed is a child and adolescent psychologist and a leading authority on raising children in the digital age. He's the author of the book, Wired Child, Reclaiming Childhood in the Digital Age, and he's a regular contributor to the Huffington Post, the New York Times, the Atlantic, NPR, and many other media platforms. He speaks internationally to parents, teachers, and healthcare providers on how to promote children's well-being in this age of addictive technology. So as you'll see in today's presentation, he offers empowering strategies that connect kids with family, protect them from screen addictions, and engage them in school and foster their positive use of technology. And Dr. Freed will be taking questions from our online audience at the end of this presentation. So take it away, Richard.
Thank you, Jean. And welcome, everyone. It's really nice to have you to share this time with you. For those of us who work with kids and families, it has been a really tough past 10 years. We've watched as a generation of girls has really fallen apart. We have record rates of depression, cutting, and suicide with girls, and our boys are not doing well either. We have a generation of boys who is struggling in school, and as they hit adulthood, is not going off to find productive work. What's happening with our kids? For a lot of us, we really see what the primary factor what's driving a generation of kids struggling are the devices, the apps, and all the technologies that our kids are living on at the expense of engaging in childhood, engaging in the activities that they need to do to become healthy, happy, successful adults. Yet while we oftentimes as child providers see that, many of the families that we work with have not seen it for many years because they've been immersed in a popular culture selling them every day on the fact that they need to load their kids up with devices and apps, and that's the secret to a 21st century childhood. So it's really made our work much more difficult. We will recommend as providers, parents, please set such and such limits on kids, only to find kids come back a month later spending even more time on their devices. So it's really been frustrating. Yet I believe right now we are at a tipping point. I know we have a pretty screen-friendly culture, but it can't hold back the weight of research which is coming out talking about the risks and the serious problems that kids living their lives on screens and phones is causing them. It seems like every day new research is coming out showing us that. We also have leading tech execs come out and say, I regret the products that we've developed for kids, and that if I'm a parent myself, I am not letting my kids use it or setting remarkably strong limits on doing so. Just in the past few days, we've seen $2 billion worth of leading Apple shareholders reach out to the company and say, we are really concerned about how your product is affecting this generation of kids, putting them at risk for emotional problems and for academic problems. So it really does look like things are changing. We are really getting there. That being said, we really need to understand I don't think that families, and I think you might believe this too or see this too, I don't think families are quite there for us to say, set such and such limit. That's because parents have so much lived in this culture, selling them on screens, that they just don't have the understanding needed to set those limits. They don't have the resolve developed to do the really tough work of setting limits with kids. So what I believe what we need to do is, in addition to talking with families about limit setting, we need to help them see through these really false myths which have convinced this generation of parents that kids are going to be completely fine. We need to talk with them about how these myths that they've been sold, that devices bring kids closer to family, and how these all these devices and apps are what help kids do great in school, and instead help our families see through that and understand that that our kids' device immersion is actually pulling them away from family and school, which need to be, and have long been, as we see in these black and white photographs, the cornerstone of a happy, healthy childhood. Our kids aren't engaging with family and school, as we'll see today. Instead, they are living their lives far too much on devices. When I talk about that today, what I really want to show us, and I'm going to start with, is just how immersed this generation of kids and teens is. Younger kids spend 5.5 hours with entertainment tech every single day. That's the red portion you see on your screen. When kids hit their teen years, they're going to continue to spend that 5.5 hours, but they're going to add to that another 2.5 hours of talking and texting on the phone. And I know sometimes us psych majors struggle with doing math, but I've been working on this all week, and I do believe that 5.5 plus 2.5 equals, for teens, 8 hours every day playing with screens, phones, and devices. And this is all entertainment based. Yes, our kids do need, as they get older, to learn to use technology productively. But that's not what's happening. If you can take a look at that little black sliver, you can probably barely see it on your screen, that represents the 16 minutes a day that kids spend using the computer at home for school. So really what this means is that our kids' lives are dominated. Childhood has become taken over, hijacked by kids' entertainment-based screen time. And so much so that younger kids spend more time playing with their little gadgets than they do in school. And of course that's true for older kids, but they spend more time playing with their gadgets than they do sleeping. Profoundly affecting how childhood, pulling kids away from the childhood we need, as we're going to see today. And I want to talk about, just for a moment, who is most affected. Because we're going to hear, oh, it's those, in our popular media, we're going to hear it's those rich kids sometimes on their devices. Nothing could be farther from the truth. As we see from this common sense media research, if you look to the left of your screen, yes, higher income kids are spending far too much time with entertainment tech at 5 hours and 42 minutes a day. But it's lower income kids who are swimming in all this entertainment tech and screens and phones. Yes, on the right of your screen, white kids spending far too much time with entertainment tech, but black kids at 8 hours and 26 minutes every single day playing with screens, phones, and devices. And these, I'm not going to talk so much about physical factors, but boy, is this driving disparities in physical issues with respect to, let's say, obesity rates. This needs to be addressed right now. If you're working with disadvantaged families, there is no more important place to look than the lives, the screen use disparities that our kids are suffering from. I am going to talk today more, though, about how screens, phones, playtime, and all this, the numbers you see here are entertainment-based screens and phones. This isn't learning-based. This is kids goofing around, playing around at the expense of the childhood that they need. I am going to talk about how technology and all this playtime tech is affecting kids' school success. And I think this is a big driver as to why we see racial and income, educational disparities, and millions, billions of dollars are being spent on that. Yet we are ignoring the reality of how our kids are living their lives. So it's time to pay attention to that. If you work with less advantaged children, this is the place that you need to focus. So I really want to talk about how the myths that are affecting the parents that we work with, and keeping them from following through with the limits that we recommend. The first place I'm going to start is with respect to technology in the family. Every day, our families are sold on the belief that technology brings the family closer together. When they flip on the TV, when they read your typical internet article, they're going to be hearing, oh, you've got to get your kids' devices so it connects them with family. For example, this Apple iPhone commercial. These are screenshots from that, really selling families on the belief that technology, that giving your kid a phone brings them closer to family. At first glance, we see from these screenshots that it looks like, if you're a parent and you're looking at that, you're saying, wow, it sure looks like a kid's playing on their phone at the expense of engaging with his family's Christmas or holiday celebration. But at the end of this ad, wonderful marketing, won an Emmy, I believe, for this best commercial. So at the end though, like what are we told? Oh, we're told that this kid has been spending the whole time videotaping family moments, and watching his creation brings everyone together. So that's really telling parents, don't believe your own eyes. You know, oh yes, sure, phones look like they're distracting kids from family, but that's not true. But really, so how has this affected the families that we work with? At least when this Microsoft poll was done a few years ago, if you look to the left, almost 2/3 of parents believe technology brings the family closer together. And then if you look to the right, younger parents, almost 3/4 of younger parents believe tech brings the family closer together. So this has really led a generation of parents to hand kids devices without considering how it really affects the family. But it's really helpful to turn to science. And that's what we need to do to look for our kid, to help our kids. Here we're going to talk about science. For example, Dr. Sherry Turkle has studied how technology affects the family. I encourage you to look. She is a psychologist at MIT and a leading author, and she is a Screen Time Action Network advisory board member. They've got some really heavy hitters, so it's a wonderful, powerful group. Her research really shows that technology is pulling the family apart. And then if we see on your screen, there's also this UCLA study. They did what I don't want happening in my house, which is they put video cameras in all these middle-class family homes in every single room, and they watched what families did from the moment kids woke up to the time that they went to bed. And what did they see? I don't want it happening at my house because I think they would see my kids up to no good, perhaps plotting against me. But in any case, what did they see? They found our kids' screen immersion and device immersion pulling them away from family, that kids ignored their parents, that parents couldn't even penetrate their kids' universe and had to retreat from their kids. And I just want to say, can you imagine going back to 1850, Oklahoma frontier, and parents going to kids and saying, like, we need wood to be chopped, and like not even being able to penetrate their kids' universe? That's unfathomable. But today it's the new normal. We also see peer-reviewed research that says that more time on tech for kids, more time on playtime tech. Learning tech doesn't seem to have this hurtful effect with kids and family, but as we saw, our kids are living their lives on playtime tech. But so more kids, the more time kids are on their devices and so forth, the less time they have with parents, the less attached they are to their parents. So we want to be talking with families about this. Yet it's not enough, I believe, to talk with families about how tech is pulling kids away from family. Why is that? When I'm talking around the nation with families, right now our families are not, they've been immersed in this popular culture so much that they don't understand, a lot of families are not understanding how important family is to kids. But our kids' attachment, their connection with family is the single most important driver of kids' health, happiness, and success. Promotes kids' emotional well-being, their academic success. It does magical things. So we want to be talking with families about just how important family is as well. Yet, okay, so families maybe understand that, okay, for younger kids, technology is important. But unfortunately, we've also been sold, parents and families have been sold this myth of detachment, which is, okay, when kids hit their preteens and teens, what they're supposed to do is live their lives on their devices, talking with peers, even if it's in their rooms, all alone, because that's what they're supposed to do. Because kids need their peers and this online presence, and with absolutely no discussion of family. What has this led to? This has led to kids that I see in my practice. I'm a clinical psychologist, and I'm working with kids coming out of the hospital who have cut on themselves, who've taken a half bottle of pills. I'm working with kids who are depressed, who are suicidal. And when I'm sitting them down to an assessment, I always ask them, please tell me how you spend your life at home. And I would say every single kid I can't think of an exception, for the past 5 years, hundreds and hundreds of kids, who are depressed, suicidal, having all these problems, I ask them, please tell me how you spend your time at home. And they all say these exact words, or something remarkably similar, so much that I know what they're going to say. They say, I'm in my room on my phone. This life normalized is pulling kids away from the families that they need to connect with. There's so much research that our preteens and teens need a strong connection with family. When we're talking with families about that, we can talk about research, but we can also go back to what I like to do is I talk with families and I say, I understand that this is kind of the normal life that we have for kids today, living their lives in their rooms on their phones. But I want to say this is much different than it's ever been for kids. I want to take, since the beginning of time, lives for families have been remarkably difficult, a struggle against a really difficult and dangerous environment. For example, I take families back to 1850, Oklahoma frontier. I say, please, and I'll ask kids this too, kids and families in the room. I say, please tell me how your son or daughter's life would be like in 1850. What would that look like? Oh, well, they'd be waking up, and I'd wake them up at 6:30, and would be working alongside one another. There'd be chores to do. They'd be taking care of the homestead, and we'd be sharing meals together. And then I'd kind of say, well, were kids off in their room? Well, firstly, there wasn't their own space. We all lived in a single room home. So I said, are kids off in their own space, living their own lives, playing with some gadget at the expense of family? And families understand that. They say, of course not. So that helps them understand the importance of kids' connection with family. But we don't get that now. And what's happening with this generation of kids, what we're seeing is something remarkably tragic and needs to get fixed, like now. It's so upsetting to see a parade of depressed, and it's happening so much with girls. Girls are being more affected, perhaps because they spend more time on social media than boys. But what do we see? I encourage you to look to Dr. Jean Twenge's research. Just coming out, a wonderful article is Have Smartphones Destroyed a Generation in The Atlantic, talking about her peer-reviewed research, which is also just coming out, but talking about how our kids' immersion in a life of phones and devices and social media is driving very high rates of depression and suicide-related behaviors. That's a disturbing, troubling word, because it means kids having suicidal thoughts and kids cutting on themselves and making attempts. Dr. Twenge, San Diego State professor, done a lot of good work. I encourage you to look to her research. But that's just so troubling. She just really showing us that this screen, phone, social network immersion is leading our kids to depression and all these suicide-related behaviors, to such an extent that the U.S. Department of Health is now saying that for girls, 1/5 of girls every single year have a major depressive episode. That means clinical depression. That means painful, nasty, dark depression, often associated with thoughts of suicide. very much time to address this. We don't have time. Like, we don't have a lot of time left. This is time to address this right now. Our kids' screen and phone immersion that is putting them at risk. So I want to talk about another myth that has driven parents to hand over devices and apps and so forth easily. And that is the belief that just these devices are driving our kids' academic success. But we actually want to look towards the research. A lot of our families are going to want to know, well, okay, if it does put my kid at risk, giving kids screens, like how much? What I suggest that we do is, because there's lots of different apps and devices and phones, what's really helpful is to look to the learning habit research. Went to 46,000 US homes and they compared kids K to 12, how much screen time they had, and that's combined screen time. TV, social media, video games, and kids texting on their phone, and they compared that to kids' combined GPA in math and language arts. And what did they see? They found that our kids' device immersion is having a profound effect on kids' academic success. What do we see? A lot of families are going to ask us, what amount of screen time puts my kid at risk? This graph here is of kids in high school from the learning habit research. And what do we see? The researchers combined screen time. So when we're looking here at screen time, this is everything, including learning-based. So kids might need to come home from school and open up their computer and do some math homework. That's included here. What we see is after about 30 to 45 minutes, kids' grades go south with respect to screen and phone time. So we want to talk with families, and that's not a lot of time. If kids are coming home and especially having to open up the computer to do some math homework, that very little screen time puts our kids at risk. And yet we saw how our teens are spending 8 hours a day on tech. That is helping us understand why American kids are, if you look at the nation's report card research, we are going backwards with respect to kids' performance in math and reading, such that 2/3 of American 8th graders score below proficient in math and reading. We are in deep trouble. It is time for schools and parents and teachers and physicians, mental health providers, school staff to address this right now. And how bad does it get? Well, if you look at kids on the right of your screen who spend who spend 4 or more hours with screen time, they're getting a GPA of 2.4. That's compared with kids who, if you look to the left, who spend less than 30 minutes on screen time, they're having a GPA of 3.5. So that is what we're seeing is a full grade point letter drop going from less than 30 minutes to 4 or more hours. For kids in high school, that is life-changing. It is remarkably, it is time to address this. For example, take a look at America's PISA scores that compare how the United States does with kids around the world. It is, we score like 35th in math. It is time to get this generation of kids off of screens, off of phones, and opening up their books and getting back to the business of learning. We saw how girls are more affected with respect to depression. Boys are the ones who are getting hammered when it comes to academics. And what do I mean by that? This generation of boys is not doing well at all. Girls, and why? Boys spend more time, we're trying to figure that out, but boys do spend much more time gaming than girls, video gaming. So if we compare, if you're the parent of a boy, this is something really to be concerned about. If you work with boys, this is something to be worried about or focused on, and talking with families about. Girls get much higher grades in elementary, middle, high school, and college, much more likely to get high school honors. And then if we want to really look at it, maybe that's not all that important to you, but if you want to think about something really troubling, girls now, or young women, represent a full 57% of college admissions. Boys, a paltry 43%. our boys are not going off to college. Why is that? A lot of them are choosing to video game. And what's remarkable is we have leading economists coming out telling us just that this generation of boys and young men, as soon as they hit work age, what are they choosing to do? Instead of go to do productive work, they're choosing to video game. That is remarkably troubling. It is, again, we are in crisis mode. It is very much time to address this. If you work with young men, you see this. They are living their lives at home, oftentimes on their parents' couch, oftentimes unemployed or very much underemployed, and with no signs of change, being very happy just to video game their lives away. So why is this happening? Why the centerpiece of a kid's healthy childhood? I know it's very much lost on our popular culture, but this is what science tells us. We've got to get our kids back to lives focused around family and school. Why is that? Why are kids getting pulled away from family and school? I think we need to ask the question, are the products that our kids playing with, living their lives on, are they addictive? Why are so many good parents saying technology is the one thing that I can't control? I've been a good parent. Why is my kid, why can't I control it? How come it's blown up? How come my kid's choosing to video game rather than go to college? How come my daughter, I can't get her off of her phone? All she wants to do is live on that. Is it possible that these devices are addictive? I can say that I see clear signs of addiction in my practice. Most evident when good parents are trying to set even modest limits on kids' tech, screens, and phones. The craziest things happen. I've got kids, big kids physically attacking their parents. I've got the police being called. I've got kids who put their fists through drywall multiple times. Police are being called. Kids are being psychiatrically hospitalized. I'm talking with a mom in Chicago who tells me that she tried to set a modest limit on her kids' video games, and he put her in a chokehold. That can kill you. So is it possible that video games and internet, and some internet apps are addictive, social media and so forth? Where do we officially stand on addiction? In the last edition of the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, known as the DSM-5, internet gaming disorder was placed in there for the first time. Not as a full diagnosis, but one that needs more research before it's fully accepted. So we really are getting there. But just to show you how slowly we're getting there, and just how behind US psychiatry is compared with the rest of the world, the last time the DSM was revised in 2013, that was the first time we ever said gambling was addictive. Like, that's scary. Like, how long have we actually known gambling to be addictive? We're just, in the US, we are slow to realize that behaviors can be addictive. We're slow to realize what the scientific consensus, which is telling us that addiction is not about a substance. Addiction is about the brain. Addiction is about the brain's response to certain substances like nicotine or alcohol, or the brain's response to certain behaviors like gambling or the internet or video games or social media. While the US is getting up to speed, China, South Korea, and Japan fully recognize internet gaming addiction, considered a major public health crisis for their youth, and that's what America needs to do right now. Just in the past few days, we've seen the World Health Organization name, that's the World Health body, say that gaming disorder is an actual diagnosis. The US needs to get up to speed and help families understand what is taking down this generation of kids. Why on earth would these devices be addictive? Well, we actually need to think about who's putting them together. You think it would be computer scientists, but increasingly it's psychologists and neuroscientists who use a black box of tricks to rope kids in and not let them go, to drive what's known as time on device. Never mind that pulling kids away from time on device means 8 hours a day and means time not spent with family and with school. For example, Dr. John Hobson, who has a Ph.D. in behavioral and brain science from Duke University, these are really smart folks, wrote the seminal paper in the gaming industry called Behavioral Game Design, in which he said, this is not to say that players are the same as rats, but that there are general rules of learning which apply equally to both. You know, and the joke's on families, I'm sorry. Does it ever seem like our kids that we work with are stuck like rats in a maze on their devices? Yes. Incidentally, Dr. Hobson, after he wrote that paper, was hired by Microsoft as a leader in game development, as a game developer, as an Xbox Live, which I lose so many of my kids to. My kids are gaming instead of, the kids I work with in my practice are gaming rather than going off to college. These really capable kids. It is remarkably tragic. And also, let's consider the words of Bill Fulton, a leading game designer. He trained in cognitive science. Again, you know, these are people who traditionally run rats through mazes and hook humans up to electrodes and study people in labs, which is happening right now, including kids, and it's remarkably disturbing. But Bill Fulton, trained in cognitive science, he tells us what the intent of game designers is. And I would say that this is the intent of also social media designers. What does he have to say? I don't like you just to necessarily read what's on the screen, but I want you to see these words because they're so powerful and they speak to why we are losing this generation of kids. He says, if game designers are gonna pull a person away from every other voluntary social activity or hobby or pastime, they're gonna have to engage that person at a very deep level in every possible way they can. I've read that 100 times or more. It is troubling, it's disturbing, it's tragic every single time. I want you to look at that highlighted portion, which I've highlighted, and tell me, you know, think about some voluntary activities for kids. What would those be? What are voluntary activities for kids? Playing outside, putting effort into homework, going on a family outing, coming down to dinner, giving a parent a hug. Are we watching as a generation of kids decides not to engage in those helpful, necessary activities and instead is being pulled away towards technology? Of course we are. Is it happening by design? I think so. We also want to think about, when we're thinking about if these devices are addictive, and this is going to drive our treatment, we need to understand if these devices are addictive. We need to look to see how it affects the brain. Because what we're seeing is when we peer inside the brain with the latest brain scan technologies like PET scans or functional MRIs, what we see is that the effects of kids on technology is remarkably similar, and young adults, the effects of folks on technology are really remarkably similar to the effects on drugs and alcohol. Reward pathways hijack key areas of the brain involving insight and judgment, such that parents say like, oh, all my kid wants to do is spend their lives on the device, and they have no insight that they have a problem, and that they have no judgment that or understanding that it's a bad idea. Yes, those brain pathways have been hijacked, taken over, and how powerful are these devices? Studies show that video gaming triggers the release of the reward-based neurotransmitter dopamine, this brain chemical, at the same level as if someone got an intravenous shot of amphetamine. So these devices really look to be as powerful as addictive drugs, and that is why we are losing our kids. So I want to talk about, we've looked at how these myths have pulled kids away from family. These myths have pulled kids away from school to live their lives on devices. Now I want to talk about how we can reduce our kids' screen time and the limits that we can talk with families about. Yet to do that, we also need to address the myths which have convinced a generation of parents to really back away, to give kids devices and to not guide them, to really turn kids loose in a way that they don't do with any other activity. So I want to look at those myths because we need to push back against those if we hope to be effective. If we just go to parents with limits, they're going to have these myths in the back of their mind that are going to keep parents from taking effective action. So let's look at these myths now. The first of the myths that I want to talk about is the myth of normalcy. This is the belief that parents see every day when they flip on the TV or look on the internet, or at least, you know, some of the shine's coming off of tech, but they've seen this in the past. This belief, and unfortunately some kind of quote unquote experts or child experts tell us this too, and it's been remarkably tragic. I encourage them to look to science rather than hype, and for them to actually be responsible. So please look at that. So look at, we need to look at the myth of normalcy, this belief that it's just normal. Just like parents are told, oh, having kids on devices today is like kids of yesteryear who rode a bike. In essence, saying that kids' lives on devices is normal. It's typical, it's normal, but that just means it happens a lot. It doesn't mean if it's a good idea. There are other behaviors that happen a lot which aren't necessarily healthy, which are extremely unhealthy, which put kids at risk. For example, not that long ago, we had this belief that smoking for kids was completely normal. There was this large group in middle school and high school that would start smoking, and there was nothing we could do about it. For example, when I went to high school, at my pretty good high school, the largest, most beautiful section of the campus was a smoking section. Hey kids, come on over. Why don't you get started smoking at school? We laugh at that now because how? Well, we actually looked to science and we brought that science to the public. It is time that we need to do that with respect. This is a smoking ad talking about this wonderful woman, Terry, who would talk at schools and talk with kids about how she got started smoking at school and how that put her at risk and caused her early disease and unfortunately her early death. She was a hero, and she went to families and she talked with them about, and she went to kids and she talked with them about the science. And this is what we need to do with respect to kids and tech. It is time to look at the science and bring it to the families that we work with. How can we do that? In this Huffington Post article I wrote, the Obama's low-tech parenting, I talk about how the Obama Kids School, Sidwell Friends, a top-rated private school in the DC area, reaches out to families and says, please please limit your kids' screen and phone use at home because it has a powerful effect on what happens here at school. Schools have a tremendous investment in this because when kids go home and they're living their lives on their devices and becoming emotionally unhealthy, and then they come to school saying they're depressed and cutting at school, that's a school matter. When kids are living their lives on their phones and video games and social media at home instead of studying and failing in school and have low college admission rates, that's a school matter. That's where schools really need to reach out to families and help them understand the risks of that. And if you're a school, it is time to get kids being on their phones at school. That has to end. Sadly, I talk a lot at a lot of more affluent private schools. They're the ones who understand this. They don't allow kids to be on phones at school. Yet at so many public schools, our kids are living their lives on their phones, and it's causing these learning disparities between these private schools and what kids have to deal with at public school. It is time to address this more at public schools. So let's bring this message to the families. Let's talk about and bring families in, because it works so much better for families if we do this as a community. This is only going to happen at a grassroots level. Families are not going to see this on their Facebook or their social media newsfeed that they're supposed to get their kids off of tech. It's just not going to happen. So what we need to do is bring this message to families and talk with them about it, and doing it in a community setting. And that works so much better when families do this together, because then they can work together. And then, because kids will push back and say, well, so-and-so can be on her phone, and so-and-so can be on his gaming all night. Well, when we come together at schools, families stand up and say, we're doing this together. And they can talk with their kids and say, we're doing this together. When I'm talking, it's great that I get out and talk, and I talk at schools and conferences around the nation. I am truthfully reaching more affluent families at present. But who do we need to reach out to? As we've seen, it's lower income and Black kids whose lives are being destroyed by living their lives on devices. It is time to help them. So we need to reach out to these less advantaged populations. If you work with them, this is the place I believe that we need to focus. It is dominating kids' childhood and wreaking havoc on it. And when we go to these less advantaged families and talk with them about limit setting, we also need to be understanding. I work with a lot of working poor families. They don't have access to these resources. If we look at After School Alliance research, these families would want to provide their kids other activities, likely than being on screens and phones, but they don't have access to them in these less affluent communities. So rather than offer these less affluent communities kids more and more devices, what we need to do is have them have safe, good play spaces, homework clubs, interactions with caring caregivers who can help guide these kids. This is what these families truly need. The next myth that I want to talk about pushing back against, which has been remarkably destructive, and families will hear this when they flip on the TV or the internet, and that is the digital native, digital immigrant belief. This is selling parents on the belief that kids are natives with technology simply by virtue of growing up surrounded by tech toys and tech gadgets, that they're natives, and that we as parents and child providers, that we're fuddy-duddies, that we just don't get it. Teachers are fuddy-duddies supposedly, and school staff don't get it. So what our jobs, that we're kind of immigrants and don't really belong there. So our job is to really hand kids lots of devices and to walk away. Who told us about this? A video game developer. I know it's been picked up by our popular media, and it's unfortunately a falsehood, but a video game developer told us that this was how it is. His name's Mark Prensky. He wrote this book, Don't Bother Me, Mom, I'm Learning, in which he tells us what he thinks about the value of parenting. Hey, mom, get out, don't bother me. I'm learning as I game. Really? What has that done with, how has that affected parenting? What kind of trouble is this generation in because this belief has been sold to them? And I just want to say, why is this belief? Why is it not? The reason why it gets over on families is because at face value it can appear true. If you're a parent, you see kids that are preteens or teens, and they're on their devices, and they look like they're such experts with them. Yet the ability to flip to a device means remarkably little compared to what's so much more important, and that is something that parents and caregivers and teachers and healthcare providers get, and school staff get, and that is because we have this developed prefrontal cortex, this area of our brain sitting right behind our foreheads that gives us judgment and insight and lets us see the big picture and gives us foresight. And that can help us see how kids' overuse of all this playtime devices is going to affect them down the road, is going to put them at risk and drag down their emotional health and drag down their school success. We see that the preteen or teen brain, unfortunately, just cannot. It doesn't have that area of the brain developed enough to gain that level of insight. I see so many kids who hit about 19 or so, then their prefrontal cortex comes online, and then they say, wow, I wasted my life doing this. I sure wish my parents would have stepped in and helped. So that's what we really want to do to help kids who can't get that. Nonetheless, unfortunately, this digital native, digital immigrant belief is sold to families in the popular media. For example, in this Time magazine article here, let kids run wild online. What a seductive message to families. you know, hey, just turn your kids loose. They're fine. You don't have to intervene. You as a parent can sit on the couch. What has this done with families? What has this done to a generation of kids? This belief has been remarkably destructive to a generation of kids, putting girls at risk for depression and all these suicide-related behaviors, and putting our boys at risk for not doing well in school. Who told us about this belief? Who wrote this article? Dana Boyd, Dr. Dana Boyd. She is a kind of says she's an expert with respect to kids and tech. She's written the book. It's complicated. And but she doesn't happen to have like a conflict of interest here, does she? She doesn't happen to work for a big company that makes a lot of money on turning kids loose with devices. Yes, she works for Microsoft. Does she tell parents about the conflict of interest in this article? No, she does not, as in Microsoft's Xbox Live. That's unethical. She also doesn't tell families that there is a big double standard here. Because while she's telling families, let kids run wild online, the founder of her own company, Bill Gates, imagine you know who he is, leading tech exec, and his wife, Melinda Gates, the richest, arguably the most powerful parents in the world, they set remarkably strong limits on their own kids' use of tech. For example, they didn't get their own kids' smartphones until they turned 14 years of age. And they otherwise set strong limits on devices. If we could have more parents do this, if we could have parents follow this example, we would not have a generation of kids falling apart. So how can we more effectively parent? How can we encourage the families we work with to more effectively parent? I suggest that we turn to science. Luckily, there's a lot of great science telling us what effective parenting is. Genius, Diana Baumrind at UC Berkeley, Maccabee and Martin at Stanford have shown us that parenting is really defined by two dimensions: responsiveness, high and low on the left, and demandingness, high and low. Responsiveness is how engaged and involved and loving we are. And demandingness is how much we set high expectations and limits to back up those expectations. Where's the sweet spot for effective parenting? Authoritative parenting, in which parents are loving and strong. We need both. Kids are happier, healthier, less anxious, less depressed, more engaged in school, higher self-esteem, higher GPA in high school, higher GPA in college. Authoritative parenting is truly the real deal. So how can we help our families provide that authoritative parenting? Let's take a look at that high level of responsiveness on the left. What does that mean? That means that being engaged, involved, and loving. It means we need to spend a lot of time and encourage our families to spend a lot of time with our kids when screens and phones are put away, whether it be kids or parents. Dr. Jenny Radesky, who is one of my heroes and another one of the Screen Time Action Network. She's on the advisory board. Again, some really heavy hitters. I encourage you to, there's a conference coming up in April for the Screen Time Action Network. Some amazing people are going to be there. So Dr. Radesky, what has she found? She studied families in a restaurant setting and found that about a third of parents spent the entire meal on their own device and didn't really engage with their kids at all. In my practice, that leads kids to be depressed, oftentimes feel empty and have thoughts of hurting themselves. Unfortunately, these devices, I believe, are addictive for parents as well. So many parents are getting stuck on these. We need to be mindful of that ourselves, and we need to be going old school. We need to be eating meals with our kids and having pancake breakfast with our kids and going out to have an ice cream night, and these regular traditions that build family. And when we do things like, let's say we take a day trip with our kids and we have them in the back and we're driving along. If your preteen or teen is with you and she or he is on their phone while you're supposedly doing family time, and your kid's engaged in peer drama and peer politics and cyberbullying and this political gamesmanship and who's in and who's out on their smartphones, that is not family time. That is destructive time. We need to have everyone put their devices away. Want to talk about that second element of authoritative parenting, that high level of demandingness. What does that mean? High expectations. Families are struggling with that now. We've become quite permissive, too permissive, far too permissive because families have been told to do so. It's time to push back. It's not family's fault. It is the myths pushed in our popular culture. It's time to push back against those myths and help families understand. If we see on the left, since the beginning of time, families have had high expectations and limits. Again, go back to 1850, Oklahoma frontier. That big teen kid on the right in that black and white photo, what was his life like all day? Was he allowed to be in some back room goofing around with some gadget? Of course not. You know, his family needed this big kid with, or big young man with, and his strong brain to help his family get through. And that's how life has always been for families. We need to bring that forward now. We need to help our families understand that high expectations and limits to back up those expectations are what the family needs, but it's also what our kids need as well to be happy and healthy. This is the most effective type of parenting. So how can we bring that authoritative parenting to kids' tech? We need to encourage parents that we work with to parent like a tech exec. I already talked about how Bill and Melinda Gates set remarkably strong limits on their own kids' use of tech. Steve Jobs, I think, set even, and Bill and Melinda Gates, you know, again, not getting their kids phones until age 14. If we had families do that across the nation, we would not have a generation of kids that is mired in the emotional and the academic problems that they are now. We've got to focus on the dominant negative force in kids' lives, and that is screens and phones. Steve Jobs set even stronger limits, I believe, than Bill and Melinda Gates. These folks have a sophisticated knowledge and understanding of how these devices, they understand the reality. Tony Fadell on the right, largely known as the father of the iPad and largely known as the father of the iPhone. CEO of Nest, again, another person setting strong limits on their own kids' use of tech because they understand how it affects them. We need to help our families do this. How can we do that? Well, if we look at this New York Times article, Steve Jobs was a low-tech parent, we see how these leading tech execs are raising their own kids with rules like no gadget use on weekdays. That's a profoundly strong rule, but it's going to be helpful to kids. Computer is only being used for homework on school nights. Emphasizing print books in the home because we know what happens when we give kids a device and pray that they, or just hope that they read on them. What do the kids end up doing on them? Pushing back the age when kids get smartphones and data plans. This is so much where the battle is. The average age when kids get a phone has fallen all the way down to 10 because of myth. And it's putting this generation of kids at even greater risk. I am concerned that this generation of kids is going to experience even greater rates of depression, suicide, related behaviors, and academic failure. We've got to turn this around now. And how can we do that? We need to look to groups. I'm going to give you a list of resources like Wait Until 8th. This is a national movement. Thousands of parents are making the pledge to not get their kids a smartphone at least until 8th grade. And that pledge doesn't become active until 10 parents at your kid's school in your kid's grade also make that same pledge. When I go to talk to schools, parents are getting together and they're forming their own Wait Until 8th groups. I encourage, we need to really look to that. It's a great resource. And a rule that all these leading tech execs all consistently did, and that is no screens, no phones in the bedroom. If we can do this, we are going to have a generation of happier, healthier kids, and we're going to reverse this generation of kids who is falling apart. I want to finish up just by talking about some science-based resources. We're here on the Children's Screen Time Action Network. This is such a powerful resource. I encourage you to come back here. We're going to have subsequent and amazing webinars from experts in their field. I encourage you to look to Free Parenting. This is a great resource, especially for raising younger kids. All these resources are available on the web, and they all, my understanding is they all have free newsletters that you can subscribe to. Families Managing Media is a science-based resource working to help educate families and talk about the negative impact of kids living their lives on devices. I encourage you to look to them. Wait until 8th. I already mentioned them. This is the way we need to really help kids, and that's to push back the age when we're giving kids devices, because in my mind, and I think evidence is strongly showing this, they're addictive. Once they get once these devices, social media, video games, and phones get their teeth into kids, good parents are finding they have completely lost control. I want you to look to Screen Schooled, which is if you're thinking about concerns about how much our kids are living their lives on devices at school, Screen Schooled is a great resource. And the authors also have Beyond the Screens, which is a group I encourage you to look on the web, give you science-based updates. And then there's my website that you can subscribe to as well. Newsletters. I do my best to write articles about what is happening with our kids and how we can help this generation. So I want to thank you so much for attending. I'm encouraging you to, this is the inflection point. This is the turning point, and I encourage you to take action.